From the eruption of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 to calls to re-examine how we discuss and teach race in educational and cultural institutions, the subject of race is never too far from the headlines. I went out to explore some of the ideas shaping Britain's racial politics and what impact they're having on society. Check this out. The shocking murder of George Floyd by a police officer in America revived the Black Lives Matter movement, sparking international protests in the summer of 2020, catapulting the subject of race and racism to the forefront of the public conversation. From the taking of the knee to the rollout of unconscious bias and diversity training to national debates about history, representation and identity. Today, once again, race in Britain has become politicised. So what is race? Does it matter? Should it matter? How bad a problem is racism in today's society? And finally, where do we go from here?
Prejudice against outgroups has been a feature of humanity since dawn of civilization, essentially. But the notion of race, the notion that this sort of perceived difference has a fundamentally biological basis, only really came about in the early modern and the Enlightenment period. Race is a way of categorizing people based on physical or social traits. So in the past, race sometimes referred to people that spoke a different language. So you would say in the medieval or Middle Ages, the French race or the German race. So referring to people based on the language they spoke. Then in the 17th century, race began to refer to people on the basis of phenotypes. So based on their physical appearances, either the way they looked in terms of their skin tone or skin color, or any sort of perceived physical traits that they shared with other people. From the 17th century onwards, that's what we usually use race to refer to.
It's been a very useful tool to organize and to explain inequality in society. So race developed in a time where you will have the notions of equality, but you will have a very strong inequality. The notion of race was used for understanding the divisions between the upper classes and the lower classes. The lower classes were seen as a different race from the aristocrats and a different race from the bourgeois population. I mean, if you're in 19th century and you were part of the proletariat or the lower class, you were really really poor compared to other people. So you have to explain how you can have the notions of equality where all men are equal, and then you have people living in a very bad situation. So
people cannot help to what race they are born, and it is only the utmost barbarism that would desire to punish them for it.
Individuals and groups have consistently struggled against theories of racial superiority and inferiority. The question is, did those movements succeed in combating racism?
I would say they succeeded to the extent of making racism within institutions formally legal. So they succeeded on that very fundamental basis. And I think that we shouldn't be sort of complacent about that, or we shouldn't sort of disregard that, because I think that's a significant achievement. Up until the 60s, institutions within society could discriminate formally against Black and other ethnic minority people. But now it's a significant transformation, especially over the last 30 years. So in the 1980s, for example, around half of the population would have been opposed to their child marrying somebody from a different ethnic group. Now that figure is about 10%, I believe.
What about today's popular anti-racist movements? Are they similar or different to those of the past? What are they primarily concerned with?
What we now have is a new movement which is less concerned with individual instances of prejudice, and also less concerned with whether institutions themselves against Black and ethnic minority people, and is more concerned with certain disparities in terms of race when it comes to things like employment and education and criminal justice system as well. One other sort of significant difference between contemporary manifestations of anti-racism and earlier forms of anti-racism is that the contemporary forms is more concerned with identity, so with how you see yourself as a person of color, how you see yourself as a Black person in contemporary society.
You were born here, you grew up here. How do you think it's changed, if at all, since you growing up or even your parent generation?
Yeah. Well, certainly growing up, I was aware I was black, obviously, in the same way I was aware that I was a certain height or I liked certain colours or songs. But the difference now, I think, is black people are almost challenged to place their race as the most important aspect about them, and also to demand that other people consider it to be the most important aspect about them as well. So it's almost been kind of, the change I would say from when I was a child is that there's now an almost a racial prism which people are almost forcing you to look at your life and your identity through. And I think to a degree that's a shame.
I think the problem with a lot of contemporary anti-racist discourse is a sort of racial essentialism in which a person's racial identity is the only prism with which we can understand and analyze, empathize that particular person. There's that presumption, for instance, that being somebody from a different race gives you access to different kinds of knowledge, which would be completely inaccessible if you are a white person. And also being somebody from a different race means that you are, for instance, more likely to be sympathetic to or more interested in certain forms of literature. So this is the basis of the decolonizing the curriculum, is certain forms of literature from Africa and the so-called third world would be more attractive to you if you're a person of a certain racial background. And I find this attitude not only misguided and not only wrong, but also patronizing and condescending as well.
I mean, there's so many things about, say, I don't know, my personality or my identity that I don't think are really anybody else's business. I don't know, my height, my religion, my favourite films. Why should, of all those things, should race be the thing that I demand that other people respect and acknowledge? So I really do think it doesn't mean I'm not proud of who I am, but I had no role in being black. It's like saying I'm proud of my height. I didn't do anything to do with it.
And so how is this new, seemingly more acceptable form of racial thinking playing out in institutions and organisations? I spoke to Jim Butcher, a lecturer at Canterbury Christ Church University who has witnessed this firsthand through frameworks like the Race Equality Charter.
Yeah, there's an organisation called Advance HE, which is funded by universities and by the government, and they deal with training for lecturers, that kind of thing. And they put this forward as a credential that universities can apply for to show their commitment to fighting racism. That's all well and good, and the sort of headline statement of the charter, I quite agree with. It talks about the importance of everybody being able to get an equal shot and an equal opportunity in education, and who wouldn't agree with that? But then when you look beneath that, there are many, many assumptions made and many values stated by Advance HE in the Critical Race Charter around issues like white privilege, critical race theory, microaggressions and so on. The whole gamut of terms that we've become quite familiar with now are kind of affirmed in writing on their website by Advance HE. So the assumption is that all aspects of university life, knowledge, curricula, how young black and white people relate to each other, is somehow informed by these divisions between black and white. People are seen categorically in those terms.
So instead of challenging the issue of race and say that there is no races, it is not a political product, they're basically saying there is different groups and we need to be able to live together.
What effect do you think this is having on society? Because it has become almost part of the dominant orthodoxy in every institution, whether that's unconscious bias training, to diversity training, to all various forms of kind of re-education around managing race and racism. What impact do you think that's had?
These things can mean well. I don't think people are sitting in offices and trying to figure out ways to divide us or kind of create friction in society. But I think ultimately that's often the impact, because again, it goes back to this thing of making race the dominant, all-encompassing prism through which every interaction is viewed. For my view, and I feel really strongly about this, the way to defeat racism is to just stop obsessing about race.
Training sessions now compulsory in some universities, where students are told as soon as they get in the door that they are white privileged or victims of white privilege. And again, a young, for example, working class white woman who struggled on her way up, well, they're not privileged. They've struggled hard for what they've got. and they shouldn't be told as soon as they get in that because of their colour they are either privileged above others or victim of others. I think that's very divisive.
Racism still persists, and proponents of popular contemporary anti-racist arguments would point to racial disparities in health, education, policing, and other parts of life to prove that we have not reached equality yet.
Disparity does not mean discrimination. There could be all kinds of reasons, economic, social, cultural reasons, why certain disparities exist. To jump immediately and say it's always racism means that we don't get to scrutinise and investigate what might actually be causing them. So again, I'm not saying racism doesn't exist, but by just saying it's the catch-all phrase for everything, what you do is you really lose the opportunity to discover the real and genuine examples of racism, and to challenge them as well.
We think about it in terms of the persistence of racial disparities. We could say that racism might play some role in the persistence of racial disparities, but racism in terms of the idea that Black people are inferior, that motivated. Racism is not the sort of solely motivating factor in those persistent racial disparities. But I think even acknowledging the fact that racism might not fully explain those racial disparities doesn't mean that we should be complacent about it. So the fact that young Black men, for example, are still more likely to be not only stopped and searched, but also more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. We might say, we need to control for certain variables which might show that this isn't necessarily down to racism, and I accept that, but still, it's still a problem that we should nevertheless focus on.
Why are we reinforcing racial thinking, and what can be done about it?
But I think that part of the answer is the fact that universities progressively, over quite a number of years, seem to be very confused about what their role is, the centrality of knowledge and skills that young people are excited by and go to university for. That seems to have been sort of decentered. It's sort of taken away from its primary position and placed alongside lots of other sort of social justice goals and skills and employment and so on. So education was already being seen as very instrumental in relation to other goals rather than as an end in itself. And so therefore, I think in many respects, people withholding the sort of critical race theory politics were pushing at an open door there, because universities were sort of looking around for new values, new ways to justify their role in society. Because one of the reasons people go to university, or at least one of the things that I valued about going to university, is the idea that whoever you were, if you like, and whatever assumptions had been made of you, you could start anew at university, you could reinvent yourself, you could transcend any assumptions that people at school or at home had about you. And yet now when we walk into a university, it seems that we are very much told that we belong to these identity groups, and our position in society is a result of belonging to a particular identity group, and we should go from there. And questioning that is often frowned upon.
I'm a father, I've just become a father again, and I think the worst thing I would ever do, my children are Black, would be to tell them that they're disadvantaged or they're victims. We have to find a way of framing our knowledge or our kind of appreciation or understanding of society in a way that doesn't perpetually victimize young people and make them think that they're going to grow up in a society where they're just going to be poorer, more unfortunate, end up in jail. It's just the wrong thing, the wrong way to raise young people, I would say.
I'm skeptical of the idea that we can completely get rid of racial prejudice in society. I think sort of outgroup hostility will always exist within us. And I even think any sort of utopian attempts to try to get rid of it would necessarily entail a sort of slightly totalitarian way of trying to control people's minds. And I think there is also that sort of tension between trying to get rid of a social evil and trying to completely transform humanity, which I'm skeptical of. But I think we should also be as firm as possible in trying to make it as unacceptable as we can.
I do not see race as something that is part of permanent human nature or part of permanent human history. So there is no discussion that there is human diversity. But what we can say is that even if we recognize the human diversity, it doesn't mean that we have the notion of race. When somebody said they're anti-racist, you have to kind of ask the question, what purpose? What is your political aim? Are you anti-racist because you want to have a better life for your family? Or do you want to have something else? Do you want to have human freedom? To show that we need to have a political aim that is wider than just challenge racism. And the political aim for me is the best, is to be able to understand that this society that we have today is preventing humanity to be free, and we need to have human freedom. So I understand transcending racial division only as part of a wider political aim of freeing humanity.